In this video, we're going to look at file handling using Python and Pseudocode, in particular the reading of text files. But first, let's think about the different ways we know of inputting information into programs. So at the moment, we can use hard-coded variables, which are great because they're quick to test, and you can test the processes and you can test the outputs of a program. But the downside is that they're quite inflexible, and you have to continually change the program in order to change the processes and the outputs. So you can then use inputs, which is where the user inputs the values, and that's great for testing different processes and different outputs. But it is quite time consuming because every time you run the program, you have to input values. And sometimes these are the same values. So there's a third way of doing this, and this is where the program reads in the values from a file or different files. And this is extremely flexible because you can have multiple files for multiple scenarios. And because it's loading it in from a file rather than you typing it in by hand, it's very quick to test the processes and outputs for these different scenarios. So let's look at the pseudocode for reading a text file. So for this purpose, we're going to have a text file called example.txt, and everything will refer to that. So we're going to open the file example.txt for read. That's our first line of pseudocode. Now, if we know how many lines there are inside example.txt, for example, if we know there's always 10 lines inside example.txt, we can just simply use a fixed loop to iterate through all of the lines in that file. So we then loop through it 10 times. We're not going to use the counter, so we can just go from 1 to 10. And then we're going to read the file example.txt, and each line from that is going to go into a variable called line, which we'll have to define up here. And because this is a simple program, we're just going to output the line from the file to the screen and end the loop. And there you go. There's an example program which opens a text file for reading, reads in 10 lines and displays it on the screen. But what if we don't know how many lines the text file could contain? Maybe it starts off at 0 and then it grows over time to thousands of lines. But we still want the program to read in all the lines and display them on the screen. Let's generate some other pseudocode underneath. So as before, we declare the string variable line, and we open the file. In this case, it's called example2.txt for reading. But because we don't know the size of the file, we have to use a conditional loop and continually test that. So we use this function called EOF, which is short for end of file, and it returns true if it's reached the end of example2.txt, and it returns false if it's not reached the end of the file example2.txt. And then, as before, we can just read a line in from the file, store that in a variable called line, and then display the variable line to the screen. And we will continually do this until the end of the file is reached. And that might be on the first run, i.e. it runs 0 times, or it could be in 1,000 iterations time. So 2 examples of pseudocode there. The first one is where you know the size of the file, or you know how many lines you want to read in every time. You can use a fixed loop, and if you want to use a conditional loop, you can do that, and it's useful if you don't know the size of the file that you're opening for reading. Let's see this in Python. So in this first example, we have declared line as a string as a comment, as you do with all variables in Python, and then we're opening the file example.txt for reading. So the R in the open function stands for read. And because we know that we want to loop 10 times, so we're setting a counter to in the range of 1 to 11, because you always go 1 higher than the number you're looking for in counter. Okay, so it stops at 10. Okay, so it does 10 lines. And then you set the string variable line to be whatever file handle reads in. Okay, and then you print the line, which is the same as output. And then because you have Python, you don't have a next counter. It's just when you unindent, you go back to the sort of main part of the program. And then the last thing we do, which is an important thing, is we close the file. So very important to close the files when you are finished using them, because if you don't, every time you run the program, you continually open the same text file, and it creates situations where sometimes you cannot write to files or read from files because they're being used by another program. So always remember to close your files, and then you're letting them be available to other programs or duplicate processes in the future. Let's look at the second program now. And in the second example, it's quite an important distinction to make. So as before, we declare line as string, we open the file. This time it's called example2.txt, we're still reading it. Now in the pseudocode we go straight into the while loop, but in Python we can't test for end of file. So we have to attempt to read in the first line of the file. Now it's an empty file, i.e. it has no lines in it, then the length of that first line will be 0. So we test it and we say that while the length of the variable line is not 0, i.e. it's greater than 0, i.e. it has something, then we output the line and then we read the next line so that we can test it again. And this is how we can implement end of file in Python. So we continue with the while loop until we reach a line where the length is 0, and then we close the file.